marble, sunlight, and the sound of metal on skin. A young Athenian heir bites leather while servants press red-hot bronze to his thighs. Hair gone, blood ignored. No cries. In Athens, pain is polish and silence is status. They'll paint his face with lead, file his teeth to symmetry, and call it clean. So here's the riddle. Why did the smartest city on earth turn beauty into a daily execution? Before diving into these forgotten stories of vanity and pain, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Athens of 450 BC wasn't just the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. It was also home to hygiene practices so extreme they bordered on self-torture. Greek aristocrats believed that true nobility could only be demonstrated through absolute control over their physical appearance, and that control came at a price measured in blood, tears, and unimaginable daily agony. Consider Alcmene, wife of the prominent statesman Nicias. Every morning at dawn, she would summon her team of specialized servants, each trained in different aspects of aristocratic grooming. First came the epilators, slave women whose sole purpose was hair removal using heated bronze tweezers. They would spend 3 hours systematically removing every hair from Alcmene's body, starting with her face and working downward to her toes. The pain was excruciating, but Greek beauty standards demanded complete hairlessness as a sign of refinement and civilization. But hair removal was just the beginning. Next came the skin bleaching, a process that involved applying a paste made from white lead, vinegar, and crushed pearls. This mixture, called psimythion, gave aristocratic women the pale, ghostly complexion that signified wealth and leisure. Servants would coat Alcmene's entire body with this toxic substance, paying special attention to her face, neck, and hands. The lead would slowly absorb into her bloodstream, causing neurological damage, kidney failure, and eventual death. But in a culture obsessed with status symbols, a pale complexion was worth dying for. The men faced their own torments. Pericles himself, the great statesman who led Athens during its golden age, underwent daily grooming rituals that would make grown men weep. His morning routine began with full-body depilation, using a technique called trichotillomania, where servants would pluck individual hairs with heated metal implements. The process took 4 hours and left his skin raw and bleeding, but Persian influence had made smooth skin fashionable among the elite. After hair removal came the application of various oils and perfumes, but not the pleasant aromatherapy we might imagine. These substances were often caustic, containing ingredients like mercury, antimony, and arsenic. The goal wasn't comfort, but transformation. Greek aristocrats believed they could literally change their essential nature through the application of these expensive, dangerous cosmetics. The teeth presented another battlefield for aristocratic vanity. Wealthy Greeks would have their teeth filed into perfect shapes by specialized craftsmen who used abrasive powders made from pumice stone and ground bone. The procedure was performed without any form of pain relief, and many aristocrats lost teeth entirely to infection. But perfectly shaped teeth were considered essential for proper speech and social interaction among the elite. Creus, a prominent Athenian politician and philosopher, wrote extensively about his own dental modifications in private letters discovered centuries later. He described having his teeth ground down and reshaped 3 separate times, each procedure lasting several days. The pain, he wrote, was beyond description, but the social advantages were immense. Perfectly sculpted teeth allowed him to speak with the precise diction expected of aristocratic oratory. The bathing rituals of Greek nobility involved more than simple cleanliness. These were elaborate ceremonies that could last entire days and required teams of specialized servants. The process began with dry scraping using curved metal tools called strigils. Servants would scrape every inch of the aristocrat's skin, removing dead cells, dirt, and the previous day's cosmetic applications. The scraping was so vigorous that it often drew blood, But Greeks believed this bloodletting purified the body and prepared it for the day's activities. Following the scraping came the application of various oils, each serving a different purpose. Cedar oil was rubbed into the scalp to prevent parasites, though it often caused severe allergic reactions. Rose oil was applied to the torso for fragrance, despite its tendency to cause skin rashes. Olive oil mixed with crushed herbs was used on the limbs, though many of these herb combinations were mildly toxic and caused numbness or burning sensations. The most extreme practice involved the use of heated stones and metal implements to reshape facial features. Wealthy Greeks would have their noses narrowed, their chins sharpened, and their brows raised using hot bronze tools that literally burned new contours into their skin. The procedures were performed by specialized slaves trained in what they called physioplasty, the art of reshaping human features. Aspasia, the famous courtesan who became Pericles' companion, underwent numerous facial modifications that left her scarred but socially elevated. Contemporary accounts describe her as having survived over 20 separate procedures to narrow her nose, raise her cheekbones, and create the distinctive almond-shaped eyes that Greek culture associated with divine beauty. The psychological toll of these practices was immense, but Greek aristocrats developed elaborate mental frameworks to cope with the daily agony. They viewed physical pain as a necessary sacrifice to the gods of beauty and status, a form of voluntary martyrdom that demonstrated their superiority over common citizens who couldn't afford such elaborate suffering. Children born into aristocratic families began these practices almost from birth. Infants would have their skulls gently reshaped using tight bandages, a process that continued for months and often resulted in permanent brain damage. Toddlers underwent their first hair removal procedures around age 3, learning to associate pain with social advancement from their earliest memories. The economic impact of these hygiene rituals was staggering. Wealthy families spent up to 60% of their annual income on grooming supplies, specialized servants, and medical treatments for the injuries and infections that resulted from their beauty practices. This created a vast underground economy of suppliers, craftsmen, and healers who served the aristocratic obsession with physical perfection. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Greek aristocratic hygiene wasn't the physical pain or economic waste. It was the way these practices created a culture of competitive suffering, where nobility was measured not by wisdom or virtue, but by one's ability to endure increasingly extreme modifications to the human body. The servants who performed these procedures lived in constant fear of making mistakes that could permanently disfigure their masters. A slip of the tweezers, an incorrectly mixed cosmetic paste, or a moment of hesitation during a painful procedure could result in the servant's execution. This created an atmosphere of terror that permeated every aspect of aristocratic household management. Yet for all their suffering, Greek nobles convinced themselves they were achieving something transcendent. They believed their painful transformations elevated them closer to the gods, that their willingness to endure such elaborate modifications proved their spiritual superiority over ordinary humans, who remained trapped in their natural, unmodified state. As you stand in that marble corridor, watching another aristocrat begin his daily ordeal of systematic self-mutilation, disguised as grooming, you begin to understand that what we're witnessing isn't hygiene at all. It's the elaborate system of ritualized torture that an entire civilization convinced itself was the height of culture and refinement. The bronze scrapers continue their methodical work, the heated tweezers maintain their steady rhythm, and the toxic cosmetics wait in their ornate containers for their turn to slowly poison another generation of Greek nobility. All in service of beauty standards so extreme they literally killed those who pursued them. But this is only the beginning of our journey into the horrific hygiene practices that defined aristocratic life in ancient Greece. What we've explored so far represents merely the daily maintenance rituals, the routine suffering that every noble endured just to appear in public. The real extremes came during special occasions, religious festivals, and political ceremonies, when Greek aristocrats would subject themselves to modifications so severe they bordered on surgical mutilation. These weren't gradual changes accumulated over time. but dramatic transformations undertaken for specific social events that required weeks of preparation and months of recovery. During the Great Panathenea, Athens' most important religious festival held every 4 years, aristocratic women underwent what they called the sacred beautification. This ritual began 40 days before the festival and involved progressively more extreme modifications designed to make them appear as living embodiments of the goddess Athena herself. The process started with complete dental reconstruction. Wealthy women would have all their natural teeth removed and replaced with carved ivory replicas, each one individually shaped and fitted by master craftsmen. The extraction process took place over several sessions, with no anesthesia beyond wine mixed with poppy extract. Many women died from infection or blood loss during this procedure, but those who survived emerged with perfectly uniform white teeth that gleamed like polished marble. Xenophon's wife Felicia left detailed accounts of her own sacred beautification in letters to her sister in Sparta. She described having her natural teeth pulled over the course of 6 days, with craftsmen working inside her mouth while she remained conscious throughout each session. The pain, she wrote, was so intense that she frequently lost consciousness, only to be revived with smelling salts so the work could continue. But dental reconstruction was merely the foundation for more extreme modifications. The sacred beautification required aristocratic women to have their skin literally peeled away and replaced with treated animal hide dyed to match their natural coloring. This process, called dermoplasty, involved flaying sections of skin from the face, neck, and arms, then grafting on prepared sheep or goat hide that had been chemically treated to appear human. The grafting process took weeks and had a mortality rate of nearly 50%. Those who survived bore permanent scars where the animal hide met their natural skin, creating a patchwork appearance that Greek society somehow considered the height of beauty. Women who underwent successful dermoplasty were said to possess skin blessed by the gods, and their social status increased dramatically. Men faced their own extreme modifications during major festivals. The Dionysiac celebrations required aristocratic males to undergo ritual scarification that covered their entire torso with intricate patterns representing their family lineage and personal achievements. These scars weren't created gradually over time, but carved all at once during marathon sessions that could last 3 days. The scarification process involved teams of specialist slaves working in shifts, using heated bronze knives to cut predetermined patterns into the skin, while the aristocrat remained upright and conscious. Anesthesia was considered cowardly, and men were expected to engage in philosophical discourse throughout the procedure to prove their mental fortitude remained uncompromised by physical agony. Alcibiades famously underwent scarification, covering his entire back, chest, and arms for the Dionysiac festival of 415 BC. Contemporary accounts describe him standing motionless for 67 hours while craftsmen carved elaborate scenes from his military campaigns into his flesh. He reportedly recited Homer's Iliad from memory during the worst portions of the procedure, his voice never wavering despite blood loss that left him pale as marble. The healing process for these scarifications was deliberately prolonged to ensure the wounds formed prominent raised scars rather than fading into smooth skin. Aristocrats would have irritating substances like ground glass or metal filings rubbed into their wounds daily to prevent proper healing. This created thick, raised scars that stood out dramatically from the surrounding skin, creating a permanent record of their willingness to endure extreme pain for social status. Religious ceremonies demanded even more extreme modifications. During the Eleusinian Mysteries, initiates from aristocratic families underwent ritual blinding, where their eyes were permanently damaged to create the cloudy, unfocused gaze that Greeks associated with divine vision. This wasn't complete blindness, but deliberate damage to the corneas using heated metal implements that left the eyes functional but visibly altered. The procedure involved inserting thin bronze rods, heated to glowing temperatures, directly onto the surface of each eye, creating controlled burns that would heal into distinctive cloudy patterns. The pain was indescribable, and many initiates never recovered full vision, but the clouded eyes were seen as proof of divine favor and marked them as spiritually elevated beings. Critias underwent this ritual blinding at age 19, and described the experience in his philosophical writings as the moment when he truly began to see the world clearly. The physical agony, he claimed, opened spiritual pathways that normal vision had blocked. His damaged eyes became his most recognizable feature and contributed significantly to his reputation as a profound thinker. The most extreme practice reserved for the highest aristocrats involved ritual dismemberment and reattachment. During certain mystery cult initiations, wealthy Greeks would have fingers, toes, or even entire hands surgically removed and then reattached using primitive surgical techniques. The purpose was to experience death and resurrection symbolically, proving their spiritual superiority through their willingness to sacrifice parts of their physical bodies. These amputations were performed by priest-physicians using bronze tools sterilized in flame. The severed body parts would be preserved in honey and wine for several days while the wounds healed, then reattached using bronze pins and silk threads. The survival rate was extremely low, and most who attempted this ritual died from infection or blood loss. Those few who survived the reattachment process bore permanent evidence of their spiritual journey in the form of visible scars, reduced mobility, and chronic pain. But these physical limitations were worn as badges of honor, proof that they had transcended normal human limitations through their willingness to literally sacrifice pieces of themselves for divine knowledge. The preparation for these extreme rituals required months of conditioning that was almost as painful as the procedures themselves. Aristocrats would gradually build their pain tolerance through daily sessions with heated implements, controlled burns, and progressive tissue damage. They developed elaborate meditation techniques designed to separate consciousness from physical sensation, allowing them to remain mentally present while their bodies underwent systematic destruction. These conditioning programs were overseen by specialized trainers called algophilists, masters of pain who understood exactly how much damage the human body could sustain without permanent disability or death. They guided aristocrats through carefully calibrated programs of increasing agony, building toward the ultimate test of whatever extreme ritual they planned to undergo. The psychological preparation was equally intense. Aristocrats would spend hours daily in meditation, designed to embrace pain as a pathway to transcendence. They studied philosophical texts that glorified suffering as the highest form of human achievement, memorizing lengthy passages that they would recite during their ordeals to maintain mental focus while their bodies were systematically modified. The social pressure to undergo these extreme modifications was immense. Aristocrats who avoided the most painful rituals were considered cowardly and found themselves gradually excluded from elite society. Their political influence waned, their business partnerships dissolved, and their children faced reduced marriage prospects. In a culture where pain tolerance was the ultimate measure of worth, avoiding suffering meant social death. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these practices wasn't the physical agony or social pressure. It was the way Greek aristocrats convinced themselves that their voluntary self-destruction represented the pinnacle of human achievement, the logical endpoint of civilization and refinement. They created elaborate philosophical justifications for their behavior, arguing that true nobility could only be demonstrated through complete mastery over physical sensation. They claimed that their willingness to endure extreme modifications proved their spiritual superiority over ordinary humans who remained trapped by natural fear of pain. The morning sun continues to filter through those marble columns as another day of ritualized suffering begins in aristocratic Athens. The bronze tools heat in their braziers, the toxic cosmetics wait in their ornate containers, and another generation of Greek nobles prepares to prove their worth through systematic self-torture disguised as the height of cultural achievement. Yet even these extreme festival modifications pale in comparison to the daily maintenance rituals that defined aristocratic childhood in ancient Greece. Children born into noble families faced a lifetime of systematic physical alteration that began before they could walk and continued until their bodies finally surrendered to the accumulated damage. The process started in infancy with cranial shaping, where newborn aristocrats had their soft skulls gradually molded using tight leather bindings wrapped around their heads. These bindings were adjusted daily by specialized nursemaids who understood exactly how much pressure could be applied without causing immediate death. The goal was to create the elongated, narrow skulls that Greek society associated with divine intelligence and aristocratic breeding. The cranial shaping process continued for the first 3 years of life, with the bindings tightened incrementally as the child's skull hardened. Many infants died from the pressure, their developing brains unable to function within the artificially constrained space. But those who survived emerged with dramatically altered head shapes that immediately marked them as members of the ruling class. Demetrius of Phaleron, writing in the 4th century BC, described watching his own grandson undergo cranial modification. The child would scream for hours as the bindings were adjusted, his tiny face turning purple from the pressure. But Demetrius viewed this suffering as necessary preparation for a life of aristocratic privilege, writing that true nobility required the ability to endure pain from one's earliest moments. Alongside cranial modification came dietary restrictions, designed to alter the child's physical development in specific ways. Aristocratic children were fed carefully controlled diets that included toxic substances intended to create the pale, ethereal appearance that Greek culture prized. These diets included regular doses of mercury, lead compounds, and arsenic mixed with honey to mask their bitter taste. The mercury was intended to create the translucent skin tone that signified divine favor. Lead compounds were used to slow physical growth, creating the delicate, childlike proportions that aristocrats maintained well into adulthood. Arsenic was believed to sharpen mental faculties while creating the hollow-cheeked appearance that Greeks associated with philosophical contemplation. Children who received these toxic diets often suffered from severe developmental delays, neurological damage, and organ failure. But Greek aristocrats viewed these symptoms as signs of spiritual refinement rather than poisoning. A child who moved slowly and spoke softly was considered more contemplative and divine than one who displayed normal childhood energy and curiosity. The educational process for aristocratic children included formal instruction in pain tolerance, alongside traditional subjects like rhetoric and mathematics. Young nobles attended specialized schools where they learned to endure increasingly severe physical modifications as part of their academic curriculum. These pain-tolerant schools, called algodidascalia, operated throughout the Greek world and followed standardized curricula designed to gradually build a child's capacity for suffering. Students began with simple exercises like holding heated objects or standing motionless while insects bit their exposed skin. As they progressed, the challenges became more extreme, culminating in procedures that would permanently alter their physical appearance. Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes attended one of these schools in Athens and left detailed accounts of his education in pain tolerance. He described daily sessions where children as young as 6 would compete to see who could endure the most severe modifications without crying or begging for mercy. The winners received social privileges and advanced placement in aristocratic society, while those who showed weakness faced punishment and reduced status. The competitive aspect of these schools created an atmosphere of escalating cruelty as children pushed themselves to ever greater extremes to outperform their classmates. Some students died from their attempts to prove their pain tolerance, but their deaths were celebrated as examples of aristocratic virtue rather than mourned as tragedies. By adolescence, young aristocrats had been so thoroughly conditioned to associate pain with social advancement that they actively sought out increasingly extreme modifications. Teenage nobles would invent new forms of self-torture, competing to discover procedures that their elders had never attempted. This constant innovation in suffering techniques drove the evolution of aristocratic hygiene practices toward ever greater extremes. The coming-of-age ceremonies for aristocratic youth involved modifications so severe they often resulted in permanent disability or death. Young men underwent ritual castration followed by surgical reconstruction designed to create artificially enhanced masculine features. The original organs were removed using heated bronze knives, then replaced with carved ivory prosthetics that were surgically attached using primitive grafting techniques. The castration and reconstruction process took place over several weeks, with the young man remaining conscious throughout each procedure. Anesthesia was forbidden as it would diminish the spiritual value of the suffering. Many died from infection or blood loss, but those who survived were considered to have achieved a higher form of masculinity that transcended normal biological limitations. Young women face their own extreme coming-of-age modifications. Aristocratic girls underwent ritual removal and reconstruction of their reproductive organs, a process designed to create the artificially childlike appearance that Greek men found desirable in wives. These procedures were performed by specialized priest physicians who claimed divine inspiration guided their surgical techniques. The female modifications were even more dangerous than their male counterparts, with mortality rates exceeding 70%. The procedures involved complete removal of internal reproductive structures, followed by the insertion of carved ivory replacements designed to maintain the appearance of virginity while preventing actual reproduction. The few who survived these modifications were considered perfect wives, eternally youthful and incapable of the physical changes that normal women experienced. The tools used in these coming-of-age ceremonies were works of art in themselves, crafted by master metalworkers who specialized in surgical implements. These bronze instruments were decorated with intricate engravings depicting scenes of divine transformation, their handles wrapped in silk and precious metals. The tools were blessed by priests before each use and were believed to carry divine power that sanctified the suffering they inflicted. The wealthy families who could afford the most elaborate coming-of-age ceremonies often commissioned entirely new sets of surgical tools for their children, each implement designed specifically for the individual modifications planned for that particular youth. These custom tool sets could cost more than a small farm and were often passed down through generations as family heirlooms. The recovery process following these extreme coming-of-age modifications could take months or years, during which the young aristocrats remained in specialized healing facilities run by priest physicians. These facilities were more like temples than hospitals, with elaborate religious ceremonies conducted daily to ensure proper healing of the extensive wounds. The healing rituals involved the application of various substances that were believed to possess divine properties, but were often highly toxic. Mercury-based ointments were rubbed into surgical wounds to prevent infection, though they often caused additional tissue damage. Lead compounds were used to reduce inflammation, though they frequently resulted in permanent nerve damage. Arsenic solutions were applied to promote healing, though they often caused organ failure. During their extended recovery periods, young aristocrats were expected to compose poetry and philosophical treatises about their transformation experiences. These writings, called Metamorphosis Chronicles, became important literary works that were studied by future generations as guides for their own modification experiences. The chronicles reveal the profound psychological impact of these extreme modifications on young minds, already conditioned to view pain as virtue. Many writers described feeling disconnected from their physical bodies after their procedures, as if they had transcended normal human limitations through their suffering. Others wrote about achieving states of consciousness that they believed brought them closer to divine truth. But, beneath the philosophical language, these chronicles also reveal the devastating psychological trauma inflicted on children who had been systematically tortured throughout their development. Many young aristocrats never recovered psychologically from their modifications, spending their adult lives in states of dissociation and chronic pain that they had been taught to interpret as spiritual enlightenment. The family celebrations that followed successful coming-of-age modifications were elaborate affairs that could last for weeks and involved hundreds of guests from across the Greek world. These celebrations, called teleiosis festivals, were designed to showcase the family's wealth and the young person's successful transformation into full aristocratic status. The festivals featured elaborate displays of the surgical tools used in the modifications, the preserved body parts that had been removed, and artistic recreations of the procedures performed. Guests were expected to examine these displays and offer praise for the family's commitment to aristocratic values and the young person's courage in enduring such extreme suffering. Entertainment at these festivals often included live demonstrations of modification techniques performed on slaves or prisoners, allowing guests to witness the procedures that the honored young aristocrat had endured. These demonstrations served both as education for those planning their own children's modifications and as reminders of the extreme nature of aristocratic transformation. The competitive aspect of these celebrations drove families to plan increasingly elaborate and dangerous modifications for their children. Each family sought to outdo previous generations and rival families in the extremity of their coming-of-age ceremonies. creating an escalating cycle of ritualized child abuse disguised as cultural achievement. As the sun reaches its zenith over ancient Athens, another group of aristocratic children begins their daily conditioning exercises in preparation for their own coming-of-age ordeals. The bronze implements heat in their braziers, while specialized trainers prepare the day's lessons in pain tolerance and spiritual transcendence through suffering. The cycle continues, each generation convinced that their systematic self-destruction represents the pinnacle of human civilization, the ultimate expression of noble birth and divine favor. The screams echo through marble halls, the tools of modification gleam in the Mediterranean sun, and another day of horror masquerading as hygiene begins in the world's first democracy. The most disturbing aspect of aristocratic Greek hygiene wasn't reserved for special occasions or coming-of-age ceremonies. It was the daily maintenance of artificial beauty standards that required constant vigilance and systematic self-destruction from dawn until dusk. Every moment of an aristocrat's waking life was scheduled around procedures designed to maintain their transformed appearance against the natural healing processes of their own bodies. Consider the morning routine of Aspasia the Younger, daughter of a prominent Athenian merchant family in 420 BC. Her day began 3 hours before sunrise with what servants called the restoration, a process designed to repair the damage from the previous day's activities and prepare her artificially modified features for public display. The restoration began with the careful removal of the wax and lead compounds that had been applied to her face the night before, to prevent her surgically altered features from healing naturally. Servants used heated bronze spatulas to scrape away layers of hardened cosmetics that had bonded with her skin overnight, often taking patches of flesh with them. The removal process left her face raw and bleeding, but this was considered necessary preparation for the day's fresh applications. Following the cosmetic removal came the daily scar maintenance. Aspasia's face bore dozens of deliberate scars from previous modifications, each one requiring individual attention to prevent natural healing. Servants would use thin bronze needles heated to glowing temperatures to reopen any scars that showed signs of fading, ensuring that her artificial features remained clearly defined against her natural bone structure. The scar maintenance process took over an hour and required Aspasia to remain perfectly still, while servants worked millimeters from her eyes with red-hot implements. A single involuntary movement could result in permanent blindness or disfigurement, but showing fear or requesting breaks was considered beneath aristocratic dignity. She was expected to engage in philosophical discourse throughout the procedure, proving that her mind remained elevated above physical concerns. After scar maintenance came the application of fresh toxins, designed to maintain her artificially pale complexion. The morning mixture contained mercury, white lead, and powdered pearls suspended in vinegar and rose water. Servants would paint this substance across her entire face and neck, using brushes made from human hair, creating a mask so thick it obscured her natural features entirely. The lead mixture required careful timing to achieve the desired effect without causing immediate death. Too little and her natural coloring would show through, marking her as inadequately committed to aristocratic standards. Too much, and she risked losing consciousness from metal poisoning before completing her morning preparations. Skilled cosmetic servants could judge the precise amount needed by watching for subtle changes in their mistress's breathing and eye movements. While the facial toxins dried and absorbed into her bloodstream, Aspasia underwent hair modification procedures that had to be repeated daily due to natural regrowth. Her scalp had been permanently scarred in geometric patterns using heated bronze combs, but maintaining the crisp lines of these decorative scars required constant attention from specialized servants called trichosculptors. The trichosculptors used miniature branding irons to burn away any new hair growth that threatened to blur the artistic patterns carved into her scalp. They worked with magnifying glasses made from polished crystal, identifying individual hairs that had emerged overnight and burning them away at the root. Using implements so small they resembled jewelry more than surgical tools, the precision required for scalp maintenance was extraordinary, and trichosculptors underwent years of training to develop the steady hands and keen eyesight necessary for their work. A single misplaced burn could destroy months of careful scarification, requiring the entire scalp to be recarved from the beginning. The most skilled trichosculptors were worth their weight in gold and were often shared between multiple aristocratic families. Following scalp maintenance came the daily reconstruction of Aspasia's artificially modified nose. Greek beauty standards required noses so narrow they could barely accommodate normal breathing, achieved through a combination of surgical reduction and daily compression using bronze clamps. Each morning, servants would insert graduated metal rods into her nostrils, stretching the surgically narrowed passages just enough to prevent complete suffocation. The nasal reconstruction process was excruciatingly painful and left Aspasia barely able to speak for the first hour after completion. But the alternative was social death, as aristocrats whose noses showed signs of natural healing were immediately recognized as insufficiently committed to their class obligations. The distinctive whistling sound of air passing through artificially narrowed nostrils became a mark of status, proof that one had undergone proper modification. The morning procedures concluded with dental maintenance, a process that required Aspasia to have her artificially straightened teeth individually cleaned and polished using abrasive compounds that gradually wore away the ivory replacements. Her natural teeth had been removed years earlier and replaced with carved substitutes that required constant maintenance to prevent decay and breakage. Dental servants used bronze picks and pumice powder to clean between each artificial tooth, removing food particles and plaque that could cause the ivory to discolor or crack. The cleaning process often damaged the gums and remaining natural tooth roots, causing chronic pain and bleeding that aristocrats learned to ignore as part of their daily existence. By the time Aspasia's morning preparations were complete, nearly 4 hours had passed and she had lost significant amounts of blood from the various scraping, burning, and cleaning procedures. But this was considered normal for aristocratic hygiene, and she was expected to appear refreshed and energetic as she began her daily social obligations. The afternoon brought its own set of maintenance procedures designed to repair damage from morning activities and prepare for evening events. The lead-based cosmetics applied at dawn would have partially worn away, requiring careful touch-ups that had to blend seamlessly with the remaining makeup to maintain the illusion of natural pallor. Cosmetic servants carried portable heating braziers and touch-up supplies wherever Aspasia traveled, ready to perform emergency repairs if her artificial appearance showed the signs of deterioration. These mobile grooming kits contained miniature versions of all the tools used in morning preparations, allowing for discreet maintenance between social engagements. The psychological toll of maintaining such extreme artificial modifications was immense, but Greek aristocrats developed elaborate mental frameworks to cope with the constant pain and degradation their bodies endured. They viewed their suffering as a form of artistic expression, comparing themselves to sculptors who shaped marble through violent chiseling and grinding. Aspasia kept detailed journals describing her daily modification experiences, writing in coded language about the spiritual insights she claimed to gain through systematic self-destruction. These journals reveal a mind desperately trying to find meaning in experiences that were fundamentally about social control and competitive display rather than genuine personal growth. The evening preparations were even more extreme than morning procedures, as aristocrats prepared their bodies for the social events where their status would be publicly evaluated. Evening modifications often involved temporary procedures designed to create dramatic effects that would fade by morning, requiring fresh applications the following day. These temporary modifications included the injection of various substances under the skin to create artificial swelling or coloration effects. Mercury-based solutions were injected into the lips to create a silvery pallor that was considered divinely beautiful. Lead compounds were injected around the eyes to create the hollow, ethereal appearance associated with spiritual enlightenment. The injection procedures were performed using bronze needles that were often reused between patients without sterilization, leading to frequent infections and blood poisoning. But the dramatic visual effects achieved through these injections were considered worth the risk, as they allowed aristocrats to display their commitment to beauty standards through obviously artificial modifications. Some evening preparations involved the temporary attachment of decorative elements to the body using primitive surgical techniques. Aristocrats would have small bronze ornaments sewn directly onto their skin, creating three-dimensional decorative patterns that moved with their bodies as they walked or danced. These decorative attachments were connected to the underlying muscle tissue using bronze wires, allowing them to respond to the wearer's movements in ways that seemed almost alive. The attachment process required cutting through skin and muscle to reach the proper depth, then threading the wires through living tissue while the patient remained conscious and alert. The decorative attachments were designed to be removed after each social event, requiring a second surgical procedure to extract the wires and ornaments from the wearer's flesh. The removal process often caused more damage than the initial installation, as the bronze elements had to be cut free from tissue that had begun to heal around them during the course of the evening. Recovery from evening modifications typically took several days, during which aristocrats remained in seclusion while their wounds healed enough to allow fresh procedures. This created a cycle where social appearances were followed by periods of forced isolation, making normal social relationships almost impossible to maintain. The servants who performed these daily modification procedures lived in constant fear of making mistakes that could permanently damage their aristocratic employers. The line between successful modification and life-threatening injury was razor thin, and servants who caused accidental harm faced execution regardless of their intentions or skill level. To minimize risks, wealthy families employed teams of backup servants who could step in if primary technicians made errors or suffered accidents during procedures. These backup teams observed every procedure, ready to complete the work if their colleagues faltered or died during the process. The competitive pressure between servants often led to increasingly risky techniques as each team sought to prove their superior skill. The tools required for daily aristocratic maintenance were works of art in themselves, crafted by master artisans who specialized in surgical implements. These tools were made from the finest bronze available, decorated with precious metals and gems, and blessed by priests before each use. The most elaborate tool sets contained hundreds of specialized implements, each designed for specific modification procedures. Wealthy families often commissioned entirely new tool sets for each season, believing that the spiritual power of surgical implements diminished with use. Old tools were typically melted down and recast rather than stored, as aristocrats feared that contamination from previous procedures might compromise future modifications. The training required to use these tools effectively took years to master, and skilled modification servants were among the most valuable slaves in Greek society. These servants underwent apprenticeships that could last decades, learning not only the technical aspects of their craft but also the complex social and religious protocols that governed aristocratic grooming. The most skilled modification servants developed almost supernatural abilities to judge the precise amount of damage required to achieve desired effects without causing death or permanent disability. They could determine by touch how deeply to cut, how much toxin to apply, or how long to maintain pressure during compression procedures. This expertise made them virtually irreplaceable and gave them a form of power within aristocratic households, despite their slave status. The daily repetition of these extreme procedures gradually transformed the bodies of Greek aristocrats into living artworks that bore little resemblance to natural human forms. After years of systematic modification, aristocrats often looked more like elaborately decorated sculptures than living people. Their features so artificially altered that they seemed to belong to a different species entirely. The accumulating damage from daily modifications created chronic health problems that aristocrats learned to view as signs of spiritual refinement rather than medical issues. Constant pain, difficulty breathing, problems with digestion, and neurological symptoms from heavy metal poisoning were all interpreted as evidence of successful transformation beyond normal human limitations. Aristocrats who lived long enough to reach old age often bore scars from thousands of individual procedures, their bodies becoming living museums of the modification techniques popular during different periods of their lives. These elderly nobles were revered as examples of ultimate dedication to aristocratic ideals. Their heavily scarred and artificially altered forms held up as models for younger generations to emulate. The competitive aspect of daily modification created an escalating cycle where each generation sought to surpass their predecessors in the extremity of their grooming practices. Young aristocrats studied the modification histories of their elders, planning even more elaborate daily routines that would demonstrate their superior commitment to aristocratic values. This constant innovation in suffering techniques meant that modification practices became increasingly dangerous over time, with each generation pushing closer to the absolute limits of human survival. The mortality rate among young aristocrats rose steadily as they attempted procedures that exceeded even their extensively trained body's capacity for abuse. The philosophical schools that flourished in Athens developed elaborate theoretical frameworks to justify these practices, arguing that true wisdom could only be achieved through complete mastery over physical sensation. They taught that aristocrats who underwent the most extreme modifications were closest to achieving divine status, their willingness to transcend human limitations, marking them as spiritually superior beings. These philosophical justifications became so deeply embedded in Greek culture that questioning the value of aristocratic modification was considered a form of impiety. Critics who suggested that such practices were harmful or unnecessary faced social ostracism and sometimes legal persecution for challenging the fundamental beliefs that supported aristocratic power. As another day of systematic self-torture draws to a close in aristocratic Athens, Aspasia prepares for her evening modification session while servants heat their implements and prepare the toxic substances that will transform her already heavily altered appearance for tonight's social obligations. The cycle continues, each day bringing fresh opportunities to prove her commitment to beauty standards that would kill her long before old age. The marble corridors echo with the sounds of bronze tools against flesh, the whispered prayers of servants hoping to avoid fatal mistakes, and the controlled breathing of aristocrats enduring another day of ritualized suffering in pursuit of social acceptance. Tomorrow will bring the same procedures, the same pain, the same desperate attempt to maintain artificial perfection against the natural healing processes of human bodies that refuse to surrender completely to aristocratic will. In this world where pain has become beauty and self-destruction has become virtue, Greek nobles continue their daily dance with death, convinced that their suffering elevates them above the common masses who lack the courage or resources to undergo such elaborate transformation. The sun sets over Athens, casting long shadows through marble columns as another generation of aristocratic children begins learning that love hurts, beauty kills, and true nobility can only be measured in blood. But the daily torments endured by individual aristocrats pale in comparison to the collective rituals that defined Greek noble societies during its most important religious observances. The festival of Hygeia, held annually in honor of the goddess of health and cleanliness, transformed the concept of hygiene from personal practice into public spectacle, where entire aristocratic families competed to demonstrate their devotion through increasingly elaborate displays of ritualized self-harm. The festival preparations began 6 months in advance, with aristocratic families hiring specialized consultants called catharsiarchs, masters of purification who designed elaborate modification programs tailored to each family's social status and political aspirations. These consultants studied the family's genealogy, analyzed their previous festival performances, and consulted with priests to determine exactly which procedures would best demonstrate their worthiness to the goddess. The wealthiest families commissioned entirely new modification techniques for each festival, paying enormous sums to have innovative procedures developed exclusively for their use. These custom modifications were closely guarded secrets until the day of their public debut, when they would shock and awe other aristocrats with previously unimaginable forms of self-transformation. Callias, one of Athens's richest citizens, spent the equivalent of 3 warships commissioning a procedure for the 434 BC festival of Hygeia that involved having his entire skeletal structure temporarily dislocated and reassembled in geometrically perfect proportions. The procedure required a team of 12 specialist surgeons working continuously for 8 days while Callias remained conscious. Discussing philosophy with visiting scholars to prove his mental clarity remained uncompromised. The skeletal reconstruction involved systematically breaking and resetting every major bone in Callias's body according to mathematical ratios derived from sacred geometry. His arms were lengthened by precisely 1/8 their original length, his torso compressed by 1/5, and his skull reshaped into a perfect golden rectangle. The healing process took nearly a year, during which he was suspended in a bronze framework that held his modified bones in their new positions while they fused. Female aristocrats faced their own unique festival preparations that often involved complete reconstruction of their reproductive systems to create artificially perfect symmetry. The procedures were based on the belief that divine femininity required mathematical precision in the arrangement of internal organs, achievable only through systematic surgical intervention. Hipparete, wife of the politician Alcibiades, underwent a procedure for the 431 BC festival that involved removing all her internal reproductive organs, carving them into geometrically perfect shapes using bronze instruments, then reimplanting them in arrangements that corresponded to sacred mathematical sequences. The procedure took 12 days and required her to remain awake throughout to ensure that divine inspiration could guide the surgeon's hands. The surgical teams that performed these festival modifications were themselves aristocrats who had dedicated their lives to the study of divine anatomy. They underwent years of training that included their own extreme modifications to purify their hands and eyes for the sacred work of reshaping human bodies according to divine specifications. These surgeon priests were required to have their fingers systematically broken and reset in perfectly straight lines, their vision artificially enhanced through controlled damage to their corneas that created specialized focusing abilities, and their sense of touch refined through deliberate nerve damage that eliminated their ability to feel pain while amplifying their sensitivity to texture and temperature. The tools used for festival modifications were created specifically for each ceremony and destroyed afterward to ensure their divine power couldn't be corrupted through reuse. Master craftsmen worked for months creating bronze instruments that were works of art in themselves, decorated with precious metals and gems, inscribed with prayers and mathematical formulas, and blessed in elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. The most elaborate festival tools were created using bronze that had been ritually purified through repeated heating and cooling cycles, while priests chanted specific invocations. The metal was shaped using hammers made from meteoric iron, believed to carry divine power from the heavens. The finished implements were so beautiful and valuable that they were often displayed in temples for months before the festivals, allowing the public to appreciate the artistry that would soon be used to transform aristocratic bodies. The public nature of festival modifications created intense pressure for aristocratic families to outdo previous year's performances. Spectators gathered from across the Greek world to witness the ceremonies, and detailed accounts were recorded by historians and philosophers who treated these events as the highest expressions of human achievement. The festival grounds were constructed like amphitheaters with marble seating arranged in concentric circles around central platforms, where the modifications took place. The aristocrats undergoing procedures were positioned so that every spectator could observe their faces during the most painful moments, ensuring that any sign of weakness or loss of composure would be immediately visible to hundreds of witnesses. The competitive atmosphere of these public modifications drove aristocrats to attempt procedures that exceeded safe limits, resulting in mortality rates that sometimes reached 30% during major festivals. But these deaths were celebrated rather than mourned, as aristocrats who died during modification procedures were believed to have achieved immediate divine status through their ultimate sacrifice. The festival of Hygeia in 429 BC became legendary for the number of aristocrats who died, attempting to surpass previous records for extreme modification. 17 nobles died during the 3-day ceremony, their bodies so extensively altered that they were unrecognizable as human remains. The survivors were permanently disabled but were awarded the highest honors Greek society could bestow, their mutilated bodies treated as living shrines to divine beauty. Children as young as 5 participated in festival modifications, undergoing procedures designed to begin their transformation into proper aristocratic adults. These childhood modifications were considered the most sacred, as young bodies were believed to be more receptive to divine influence and more capable of achieving perfect transformation. The children's modifications were performed by specially trained priest surgeons who had taken vows of celibacy and undergone their own extreme purification rituals. These specialists were required to live in temple complexes year-round, maintaining their bodies in states of constant modification to ensure their readiness for the sacred work of reshaping young aristocrats. Pericles' own grandson underwent festival modification at age 7, having his spine systematically curved into a perfect spiral pattern that required breaking and resetting 17 vertebrae over the course of 6 hours. The child was expected to recite epic poetry throughout the procedure, and historical accounts record that his voice never wavered, despite the excruciating pain of having his backbone systematically destroyed and rebuilt. The recovery periods following festival modifications were treated as religious retreats, with aristocrats spending months in specialized healing temples where their wounds were tended by priest-physicians who combined medical knowledge with ritual purification practices. These healing temples were architectural marvels, designed to promote both physical recovery and spiritual transformation. The healing process involved daily ceremonies where recovering aristocrats would display their wounds to visiting pilgrims, who would offer prayers and donations in exchange for the privilege of witnessing divine transformation and progress. The most severely modified aristocrats became permanent temple residents, their bodies too damaged for normal life but too sacred to be hidden from public view. Some healing temples developed into permanent communities where extensively modified aristocrats lived together in states of chronic pain that they had learned to interpret as continuous divine communion. These communities became centers of philosophical and religious learning, as their residents were believed to possess wisdom unavailable to those who retained normal human forms. The economic impact of festival modifications extended far beyond the immediate costs of procedures and tools. Entire industries developed to support the preparation, execution, and recovery phases of aristocratic transformation. Specialized farms bred animals whose organs could be used for human transplantation. Mines were dedicated to extracting the specific metals required for surgical tools. Workshops employed hundreds of craftsmen creating the implements, restraints, and decorative elements needed for modification ceremonies. The festival of Hygiene became so central to Greek economic life that its cancellation during wartime could cause widespread unemployment and social disruption. The festival economy employed thousands of people across the Greek world, from the surgeons and craftsmen directly involved in modifications to the farmers, miners, and merchants who supplied the raw materials needed for aristocratic transformation. Foreign visitors from across the Mediterranean would travel to Athens specifically to witness festival modifications, bringing trade and cultural exchange that helped spread Greek influence throughout the ancient world. These visitors often returned home with detailed descriptions of the procedures they had witnessed, leading to the adoption of similar practices in other cultures that sought to emulate Greek sophistication. The philosophical schools that flourished around festival culture developed increasingly complex theoretical frameworks to justify the extreme nature of aristocratic modifications. These schools taught that physical transformation was merely the visible manifestation of spiritual evolution, and that the pain endured during modification procedures was evidence of the soul's progress toward divine perfection. Students at these philosophical schools were required to undergo their own modification procedures as part of their education, though these were typically less extreme than those performed on aristocrats during festivals. The student modifications served both as learning experiences and as demonstrations of the philosophical principles they were studying. The most advanced students competed to develop new modification techniques that could be offered to aristocratic patrons during future festivals. These innovations were treated as philosophical discoveries, equivalent to major advances in mathematics or astronomy, and successful innovators were awarded positions of high honor within the schools. The influence of festival modification culture extended into every aspect of Greek art, literature, and architecture. Sculptors created works that depicted idealized human forms, showing the effects of various modification procedures. Poets composed epic verses celebrating the courage of aristocrats who had undergone the most extreme transformations. Architects designed buildings that incorporated spaces specifically intended for modification procedures and recovery periods. The artistic representations of modified aristocrats became the standard for beauty throughout the Greek world, influencing aesthetic preferences that would persist for centuries. Natural human forms came to be seen as crude and unfinished, lacking the divine perfection that could only be achieved through systematic surgical intervention. As the final shadows of dusk settle over those marble corridors where we began, the bronze tools grow cold in their braziers, and another day of systematic self-destruction, disguised as civilization, draws to its close. We've walked through a world where beauty demanded blood, where status required suffering, and where the pursuit of physical perfection became a slow dance with death that consumed entire generations of Greek nobility. These weren't isolated acts of vanity or occasional lapses into cruelty. They were the systematic foundations upon which an entire culture built its understanding of human worth, divine favor, and social hierarchy. The same minds that gave us democracy and philosophy, mathematics and theater, also created beauty standards so extreme they literally killed those who pursued them. The horrific irony is inescapable. Greek civilization, celebrated for its contributions to human knowledge and cultural advancement, simultaneously practiced forms of ritualized torture that would make modern audiences recoil in horror. Yet for centuries, these practices were not only accepted but celebrated as the highest expressions of refinement and spiritual achievement. Perhaps the most chilling aspect isn't the pain itself, but how completely an entire society convinced itself that systematic self-mutilation represented the pinnacle of human achievement. Every generation passed down these practices to their children, each one pushing the boundaries further, convinced they were preserving the sacred traditions that separated them from the barbarous masses. Standing in those ancient ruins today, you can almost hear the echoes of bronze scrapers against skin, the whispered prayers of servants hoping to avoid fatal mistakes, the controlled breathing of aristocrats enduring another session of beautification that would leave them scarred, poisoned, and one step closer to an early grave. The marble columns still stand, the philosophical texts still inspire, but the screams have long since faded into silence. Yet their message remains clear for anyone willing to listen. Civilization's greatest achievements and its most horrific cruelties often emerge from the same source: the human capacity to convince ourselves that our suffering serves some higher purpose, even when that purpose is nothing more than the preservation of power and the performance of status in a world that mistakes extreme behavior for noble virtue.